The air was thin and sharp, tasting of pine and cold stone, a stark contrast to the thick recycled air of the city he had left behind. 18-year-old Marcus Thorne stood at the edge of an impassable dirt track, his rented car ticking as it cooled behind him. Before him, nestled in a vast silent valley and dwarfed by the jagged, snow-dusted peaks of the San Juan Mountains, was a small, weathered log cabin. Its roof sagged, a barn next to it listed to one side, and the fences were little more than broken teeth against the wild landscape. It was a picture of decay, of abandonment. And yet, as Marcus stared at this broken piece of land that was somehow his, a tremor started deep in his chest. It grew into a wave, crashing through the emotional walls he had spent 16 years building, and he doubled over, racked by violent, gut-wrenching sobs that tore from him without permission. He was crying for a home he'd never had, for a family he'd never known, and for a profound sense of belonging that was both terrifying and utterly overwhelming. This is a story about finding a foundation on broken ground, about the quiet acts of love that can echo through generations, even when we think we're completely alone. It's about the revolutionary feeling of having a place to plant your roots after a lifetime of being told you don't belong anywhere. If this journey is already resonating with you, please take a moment to support our storytelling by hitting the like button. We'd also love to see how far this story travels, so let us know in the comments where you're listening from today. And make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because the path that led Marcus to this raw, life-altering moment is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, and you will want to hear how it all unfolds. Every part of this story is worth your time, right to the very end. But to understand why this dilapidated inheritance could shatter the emotional armor of a young man who had learned never to feel, we must go back. We have to leave the profound silence of the mountains and return to the sterile, indifferent noise of the city. Our story doesn't truly begin here, with tears of overwhelming release in the high-altitude wilderness. It begins 4 days earlier, in a small beige office in Denver. It begins on the morning Marcus Thorne officially aged out of the foster care system, a legal adult with nothing but a worn backpack containing all his worldly possessions, $270 in cash, and a future that felt as empty and vast as the Colorado sky above him. His 18th birthday was not a celebration. It was an eviction notice from the only life, however unstable, he had ever known. The air in the cubicle tasted of stale coffee and disinfectant, a scent Marcus Thorne had come to associate with finality. For 16 years, the Denver foster care system had been the only parent he had ever known, a distant bureaucratic entity that provided shelter and paperwork, but never a home. Now, on the morning of his 18th birthday, he sat on a worn vinyl chair across from Mrs. Rodriguez, his 5th social worker, whose desk was a fortress of manila folders and stacked reports. The fluorescent lights above hummed with a monotonous, indifferent buzz, casting a flat, shadowless light on the beige walls. This room was the system personified, sterile, functional, and utterly devoid of warmth or personal history. It was a place for processing cases, not for nurturing lives, and Marcus' case file 734B was about to be closed, stamped, and archived. He felt the familiar, hollow ache of transition, a feeling he had learned to pack away as neatly as the few belongings in his backpack. Marcus Thorne himself was a study in deliberate neutrality. He had spent his entire adolescence perfecting the art of being forgettable, a survival tactic learned through a dozen foster homes and 3 different group facilities. He kept his expression placid, his voice even, his needs minimal. He was of average height and build, with dark, unmemorable hair and eyes that seemed to absorb light without reflecting it. This carefully constructed invisibility was his armor, a shield against the inevitable pain of attachment and the casual cruelty of indifference. To want something, to be seen, was to give people power over you, and Marcus had learned that lesson with the brutal efficiency of repeated loss. So he sat perfectly still, a ghost in the machine, waiting for the final gear to turn and release him into a world he was certain had no place for him. His posture was straight, his hands resting calmly in his lap, betraying none of the quiet terror that was coiling in his stomach. The term for his situation was aging out. It was a sterile, bureaucratic phrase, for what felt like being pushed off a cliff in slow motion. For years, his 18th birthday had loomed not as a milestone of freedom, but as a deadline for eviction. The system had fulfilled its legal obligation. He was now an adult, responsible for himself, a fact that was both a terrifying void and a bitter, hollow victory. He knew the statistics because the social workers always recited them in grim, cautionary tones. He knew that a terrifyingly high percentage of youth who aged out of foster care faced homelessness, unemployment, and incarceration within the first year. The $270 in his pocket, a standard transition stipend, felt less like a starting fund and more like a countdown timer. Each dollar spent a tick closer to a future he was desperately trying not to imagine. A future lived on the margins, just as invisible as he was now, but without even a roof. His childhood was not a collection of memories, but a catalogue of temporary addresses, a blur of strange kitchens, unfamiliar bedrooms, and the faces of temporary guardians who ranged from kind but overwhelmed to openly resentful. He had been abandoned at a hospital when he was 2, a detail he only knew from his file, a single stark sentence that formed the entire basis of his origin story. From there, his life had been a series of placements, each move severing the fragile roots he had tried to put down. He learned not to unpack his bag completely, to keep his most valued possessions, a worn paperback, a small smooth stone, within easy reach. He learned the specific sound a car door made when a social worker was arriving to take him to the next house, a sound that still made his stomach clench with a Pavlovian dread, even now, sitting in this final office. The greatest lesson the system had taught him was the danger of emotion. He had learned early that hope was a dangerous substance, an internal poison that made the inevitable disappointments more painful. He remembered one foster mother, a woman named Sarah, who had a warm laugh and smelled of cinnamon. For 6 months, he had allowed a sliver of that hope to grow, a tiny, fragile green shoot in the barren soil of his heart. He had started to call her by her first name instead of Ma'am. He had even helped her plant a small garden in the backyard. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, his social worker arrived. Sarah's husband had lost his job. They couldn't afford to keep him. The memory of her tear-streaked face as he was led away was the last time he allowed himself to feel that deeply. After that, he built his walls higher and thicker, brick by emotional brick. His only true skill, honed over 16 years of being an outsider looking in, was invisibility. He became a master of observation, a silent student of human behavior. He could enter a new home and, within hours, understand its delicate ecosystem, who held the power, what topics were to be avoided, where the quietest corner to read could be found. He learned to anticipate needs, to do his chores without being asked, to fade into the background like a piece of furniture. This talent for self-effacement kept him safe. It minimized conflict and made him an easy placement, a label that ensured he was never the first one to be sent away when things got difficult. He moved through the lives of others like a shadow, leaving behind only the faintest impression, a quiet boy who never caused any trouble, a name on a form that was soon replaced by another. He was a placeholder in other people's families. The worn canvas backpack resting by his chair was not a piece of luggage. It was his entire archive, the sum total of his 18 years of existence. Inside it contained 3 t-shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, a few pairs of socks and underwear, a toothbrush, and the worn copy of a book about surviving in the wilderness that he'd read a dozen times. There was no photo album, no childhood toys, no sentimental keepsakes from a loving family. The only thing of value was the thin envelope containing his birth certificate, his social security card, and the $270 in cash. This small collection of items was the material evidence of his life, a testament to a transient existence where possessions were a liability, something to be lost or left behind in the next hasty departure. The lightness of the bag was a physical manifestation of his untethered state. He had nothing and no one to weigh him down. His ambitions for adulthood were brutally practical, stripped of any youthful optimism. His plan, if it could be called that, was a simple 3-step survival algorithm. First, find a job, any job that offered a steady paycheck, washing dishes, stocking shelves, sweeping floors. Second, use that paycheck to rent a room, the cheapest he could find, probably shared with strangers. Third, Work as many hours as possible to keep that room and avoid the ever-present spectre of the streets. There were no dreams of college, no thoughts of a career, no space for relationships. His entire mental energy was focused on the immediate future, on navigating the next 24 hours, and then the 24 after that. Success in his mind was not about thriving, it was about the simple, profound act of not failing, of not becoming another statistic in a binder on a desk just like this one. Mrs. Rodriguez, the social worker assigned to his case for the final 18 months, was a woman worn smooth by the relentless friction of the system she served. Her smile was tired, her movements practiced and efficient. Marcus knew she wasn't unkind. She was simply overwhelmed, responsible for dozens of children, each with their own complex history of trauma and need. To her, he was one of the success stories. He had graduated high school, had no criminal record, and wasn't struggling with addiction. He was a file she could close with a sense of accomplishment. She saw him not as a young man, standing on the precipice of a terrifyingly empty future, but as a case reaching its satisfactory conclusion. He felt no resentment toward her for this. It was simply the nature of the machine. She was a cog, and he was the product being discharged from the assembly line. The pen she offered him felt unnaturally heavy, a small plastic tool tasked with severing the last thread, connecting him to any form of institutional care. He took it, his fingers closing around the cheap plastic. He signed his name, Marcus Thorne, on the designated line of the emancipation document. The name itself felt borrowed, a label assigned to him by the state. He had no connection to Thorne, no family history to give it weight or meaning. It was just a sound. As the ink dried on the paper, a profound and dizzying sense of isolation washed over him. Until this moment, he had technically belonged to the state of Colorado. Now he belonged to no one at all. He was officially, legally, and completely alone, a sovereign nation of one, with no allies and no territory to call his own. The hum of the fluorescent light seemed to grow louder, filling the sudden, terrifying silence of his independence. The very idea of family, of a bloodline, felt like a story written in a foreign language he could never hope to understand. He would see families in parks or at the grocery store, the easy affection, the shared jokes, the unconscious gestures of belonging, and he would watch them with the detached curiosity of an anthropologist studying a strange and fascinating tribe. He couldn't comprehend the feeling of looking at someone and seeing a reflection of himself, of knowing that his history was intertwined with theirs. His history was a blank page, a narrative that began and ended with his own solitary existence. He was a person without a past, a fact that made the prospect of building a future feel like trying to construct a house without a foundation, on shifting, uncertain ground. He carried the knowledge of his origin like a smooth, cold stone in his pocket, a constant, silent weight, abandoned at 2. The words were clinical, devoid of the raw human tragedy they represented. He had no memory of his mother, no face to attach to the act of being left behind. She was a ghost, a question mark at the center of his life. This foundational act of rejection had shaped everything that followed, convincing him on a cellular level that he was not someone worth keeping. It was the quiet, insidious whisper that accompanied every departure, every new placement, every indifferent glance. It was the core belief from which all his defenses had grown. If his own mother hadn't wanted him, why would anyone else? This question was the bedrock of his solitude, the unassailable logic that kept his heart safely locked away. With the paperwork signed and filed away in a manila folder, a sense of anticlimax filled the small space. The transaction was complete. Mrs. Rodriguez offered him a final weary smile and a handshake, her grip brief and professional. She wished him luck, the words sounding hollow and automatic in the sterile air. This was it, the end of 16 years. There was no ceremony, no heartfelt goodbye, just the quiet closing of a file. He was expected to stand up, walk out of the office, and disappear into the city. Another anonymous face in the crowd. He was a problem that had been solved, a responsibility that had been discharged. The system had moved on, and now so must he. He prepared himself to leave, to step out of this beige room and into the vast, terrifying emptiness of his new life. He took one last mental photograph of the room, The beige fabric of the cubicle walls, the faint water stain on a ceiling tile, the hum of the computer on the desk. He committed it to memory, not out of sentiment, but as a conscious act of closure. This drab, impersonal space was the last room of his childhood. It was a bleak and fitting end to a chapter of his life defined by institutions and bureaucracy. As he stood, shouldering the light weight of his backpack, he felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his gut, but it was overlaid with a grim determination. He had survived the system. Now he just had to survive everything else. He had no idea that the entire trajectory of his carefully managed, minimalist existence was about to be shattered by a single, unexpected envelope. Just as he turned to walk toward the glass doors that led out into the indifferent city, Mrs. Rodriguez cleared her throat, a sound that made him pause with the learned obedience of a lifetime. He looked back, expecting a final piece of advice or a forgotten pamphlet on transitional housing. Instead, she was holding a thick, cream-colored envelope, the kind of heavy, expensive paper he had only ever seen in movies. It felt out of place in the cheap, functional world of the social services office. His name, Marcus Thorne, was typed neatly on the front, and in the upper left corner was an embossed return address for a law firm in a town he had never heard of, Durango, Colorado. The object felt alien in his hands, weighty and significant, a piece of a world he had no access to. A formal correspondence for a life he didn't lead. He stared at it, a knot of confusion tightening in his chest, wondering who would be writing to him, especially through a lawyer. Mrs. Rodriguez offered a small apologetic shrug, explaining that the letter had arrived 2 weeks prior with specific instructions. It was to be held and given to him only after he had officially signed his emancipation papers, not a moment before. The explanation did little to clear his confusion. It only deepened the mystery, adding a layer of deliberate legalistic timing to the puzzle. He didn't know anyone. His entire social circle consisted of other foster kids and the rotating cast of adults paid to manage his existence. The idea that someone outside this closed loop knew his name, knew where he was and had hired a lawyer to contact him, was so far beyond his realm of experience that it felt like a mistake. He ran his thumb over the crisp edge of the envelope, the paper feeling unnervingly solid, a tangible object connecting him to an unknown past he was certain did not exist. He found a hard plastic chair in the building's sterile lobby, a space designed for waiting, and carefully tore the envelope open. The scent of quality paper and ink rose from the contents, a smell of money and importance that was utterly foreign. The first page was a letter, written on thick letterhead, its language dense with legal terms he could barely decipher. But a few words leaped out at him, shattering the quiet numbness of his morning. He read the phrases again and again, trying to make them fit into the framework of his reality. James Redhawk, deceased, great uncle, and the most impossible phrase of all, sole heir to his entire estate. He felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the beige tiled floor beneath him had suddenly tilted. An estate, a great uncle. These were words for other people, for families with histories and connections, not for a boy whose entire past fit into a single manila folder. Any flicker of bewildered hope was immediately and brutally extinguished by a second, more informal letter stapled to the back of the legal document. This one was from the lawyer himself, a Mr. Hoskins, and its tone was not congratulatory. It was cautionary. The words were blunt, stripped of all legal jargon, and they painted a stark and unforgiving picture. The estate, known as the Red Hawk Ranch, consisted of 120 acres of mountain land near a town called Silverton. But the lawyer made it painfully clear that this was not some picturesque inheritance. The property was described as being in a state of advanced disrepair. The main cabin was barely habitable, the barn was on the verge of collapse, and the fences had long since been reclaimed by the wilderness. The images formed in his mind were not of a home, but of a ruin, a monument to decay. Then came the numbers delivered with the cold, hard impact of a physical blow. The property carried an outstanding lien for $6,000 in unpaid property taxes. $6,000. The figure seemed to hang in the air in front of him, mocking the $270 folded neatly in his pocket. It was an astronomical sum, an impossible debt that he could never hope to pay. The urgency of the threat was immediate and absolute. A tax lien meant the property was on a direct path to being seized by the county. Far from being a gift, this inheritance was a ticking financial time bomb, an anchor of debt that would pull him under before he could even take his first breath as an independent adult. The trap was laid, and the bait had been the fantasy of a family he never had. The lawyer's letter continued its grim inventory, each sentence adding another layer of impossibility to the situation. There were no functioning utilities on the property. The electricity had been disconnected years ago, and there was no running water connected to any municipal system. To make the place livable would require not just repairs, but a complete and costly overhaul of its basic infrastructure. Mr. Hoskins's message was an unambiguous warning. Accepting this inheritance would be an act of financial suicide. It would indebt him, isolate him, and ultimately leave him with nothing but a worthless piece of land he couldn't afford to keep or sell. The system hadn't even let him go for 5 minutes before the world had found a new, more creative way to set him up for failure. A familiar bitterness rose in his throat, the metallic taste of a cruel joke played at his expense. For a fleeting moment, he had felt a connection, a sense of being chosen. Now he just felt foolish. Of course it was a trap. The world didn't give things to boys like him. It took them. This was just a more elaborate version of the same lesson he had learned a dozen times before. His mind, the practical, survival-oriented machine he had built over 16 years, immediately rejected the entire proposition. The only logical course of action was to walk away. He would leave the envelope on the chair, exit the building, and proceed with his original plan. Find a job washing dishes, rent a cheap room, and forget this ever happened. It was the only way to protect himself from the crushing weight of a false hope. He folded the letters and slid them back into the thick envelope, his movements precise and controlled, betraying none of the turmoil inside him. He was ready to discard it, to sever this bizarre and dangerous connection to a past he didn't want. But his eyes caught the name on the legal document one last time. James Redhawk, a great-uncle. A whisper of a blood connection, the first he had ever encountered. The man was a ghost, a complete unknown. Yet he had known Marcus's name. He had tracked him down through the bureaucratic maze of the foster care system. And for reasons Marcus couldn't begin to fathom, this stranger had chosen to leave him the only thing he had in the world. It was a broken, dangerous, and impossible gift, but it was a gift nonetheless. This single, stubborn fact lodged itself in his mind, a small, unmovable stone against the tide of his logic. For the first time in his 18 years of life, someone had left something specifically for him. Not for the state, not for a temporary guardian, but for him. The sheer novelty of the idea was disorienting. The threat was clear, the risks were enormous, and every instinct for self-preservation screamed at him to run. But the quiet, revolutionary feeling of being named, of being the intended recipient of a legacy, however broken, held him in place. The simple, straightforward path he had imagined for his future had vanished, replaced by a choice he never thought he would have to make. The choice between guaranteed survival and the terrifying, unknown possibility of belonging somewhere. For several long minutes, Marcus remained frozen on the hard plastic chair in the lobby, the world outside the plate-glass windows moving on without him. The thick envelope felt impossibly heavy in his lap, a physical anchor holding him in this sterile, transitional space. His mind, the meticulously ordered fortress he had built to survive, was in chaos. Every rational instinct, every lesson learned over 16 years of disappointment and loss, screamed at him to stand up, walk to the nearest trash can, and dispose of this poisonous document. It was a phantom inheritance, a cruel illusion designed to lure him into a debt he could never escape. The logical path was clear. Forget the name James Redhawk, forget the mountains, and proceed with the grim, practical plan for survival he had laid out for himself. The city offered a known kind of misery, a predictable struggle. This letter offered a new and terrifying species of failure, one wrapped in the false promise of a home. The internal monologue was a relentless, brutal cross-examination. $6,000. The figure was a wall, insurmountable and absolute. He reread the lawyer's words. The phrases advanced disrepair, and no functioning utilities echoing in his head. This wasn't a fresh start, it was a graveyard. He would be trading the concrete jungle of Denver for a literal wilderness, exchanging the anonymity of the city for a profound and crushing isolation. The smart move, the only move, was to protect the meager resources he had. His $270 was a lifeline, the only thing standing between him and a homeless shelter. To waste a single cent of it on a fool's errand, on a dilapidated cabin owned by a ghost, was not just irresponsible, it was a betrayal of the one person he had ever been able to count on: himself. The Marcus who had survived the system would never make such a reckless, emotional choice. But as he moved to tuck the letter away, to finalize his decision to ignore it, his thumb brushed against the typed name one last time. James Redhawk, a great-uncle. The words were a tiny crack in the thick wall of his logic. This man, a stranger from a life he never knew he had gone to the trouble of finding him. He hadn't just died and left his affairs in a mess. He had orchestrated this moment, ensuring this letter reached Marcus at this exact time, on this exact day. It was a deliberate act. For the first time, Marcus felt the weight not of a debt, but of a final wish. It was an impossible, burdensome, and deeply unfair request, yet it was a request made specifically of him. A sudden defiant spark ignited in the cold, empty space in his chest. It was a feeling so foreign he could barely name it, a flicker of stubborn, irrational curiosity that felt more powerful than fear. He had to know. He had to see. In that instant, the decision was made. It wasn't a logical conclusion reached through careful consideration. It was an instinctual surge, a gut-level rejection of the safe, miserable future he had accepted for himself. He stood up abruptly, the plastic chair scraping against the linoleum floor. He would go. He would see this place with his own eyes. If it was a ruin, if it was a trap, then he would turn around and walk away, poorer, but with the certainty of having seen the truth for himself. But he would not spend the rest of his life wondering. He would not let the ghost of a man he never knew, and the fear of a debt he couldn't pay, make his first decision as a free man for him. This one choice, this one journey, would be his alone. He shoved the envelope into the front pocket of his worn jacket, the crisp paper, a firm, reassuring presence against his chest. The plan formed with the frantic, simple logic of desperation. He needed a car. His backpack was already packed with everything he owned. He pulled out his phone, his fingers fumbling slightly as he searched for the cheapest car rental agency near the downtown area. The screen glowed with options, each one representing a significant portion of his total net worth. He found a small, local company a dozen blocks away that offered a 2-day rental on a compact car for a flat rate. The price made his stomach clench. $135, almost exactly half of everything he had. The number stared back at him from the phone's screen, a digital dare. It was a point of no return. Once that money was gone, his safety net was gone. The possibility of affording a security deposit on a room would vanish, leaving him with only one option: for this wild, impossible gamble to pay off. He did the math in his head, the numbers stark and unforgiving. After the rental, he would have $135 left for gas, food, and whatever came next. It was a razor-thin margin for a journey of hundreds of miles into the unknown. For a moment, the sheer recklessness of it all threatened to overwhelm him, to pull him back to the cold, hard safety of logic. He could still turn back, walk out of the building, and find the nearest dishwashing job. But the image of the name on the envelope, James Redhawk, rose in his mind again, not as a threat, but as a question. It was a question he now realized he was willing to pay $135 to answer. He took a deep, steadying breath, closed the browser on his phone, and began walking toward the exit, his stride more purposeful than it had been just 10 minutes earlier. Stepping out onto the street, the city air hit him with its familiar mix of exhaust fumes and indifference. The sounds of traffic, the hurried footsteps of pedestrians, the distant wail of a siren. It was the soundtrack of the only world he had ever known. But now, it sounded different. It was the sound of a life he was actively choosing to leave behind, at least for the next 2 days. He looked at the anonymous faces in the crowd, the people rushing to their jobs, their appointments, their lives. He had always been one of them, a ghost moving through the concrete canyons. This was his silent farewell to that existence. He wasn't just driving to a piece of land. He was driving away from the certainty of being invisible, toward the terrifying possibility of finally being seen, even if only by the mountains and the memory of a dead man. The walk to the rental agency was a journey through a landscape of internal fear. With every step, his mind catalogued the risks. What if his age was an issue? What if they required a credit card he didn't have? What if the car broke down in the middle of nowhere? He confronted each fear with a new, unfamiliar resolve. He would handle it. He would figure it out. This was the first real test of his adulthood, a problem not assigned to him by the system, but one he had chosen for himself. He rehearsed the conversation in his head, projecting a confidence he didn't feel, preparing to act like a young man who belonged in the world, who rented cars and took trips to the mountains as a matter of course. He was constructing a new identity in real time, one built on a foundation of pure, unadulterated will. An hour later, he stood in another small, functional office, this one smelling of cheap air freshener and rubber floor mats. The transaction was surprisingly simple. The clerk, a bored young woman, barely looked up as she processed his debit card and driver's license. He paid the fee in cash, the crisp bills feeling like a sacrifice as he slid them across the counter. She handed him a set of keys attached to a plastic tag, the metal cool and solid in his palm. It felt more significant than any document he had ever signed. This was not an emancipation form severing a connection. It was a key, a tool for forging a new one. The weight of it in his hand was the weight of his own agency, a small tangible piece of control over his own destiny. He walked out into the parking lot, the jingle of the keys the only sound accompanying his determined footsteps. He found the car, a small, unremarkable sedan that was clean but showed its age. He slid into the driver's seat, the worn fabric a welcome change from the hard plastic of the lobby chair. He sat there for a long moment, simply breathing. He placed the envelope from Mr. Hoskins on the passenger seat, where it sat like a silent co-pilot, a paper map to a life he couldn't yet imagine. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was now overshadowed by a powerful, driving sense of purpose. He was no longer just Marcus Thorne, case file number 734B. He was the sole heir to the Red Hawk Ranch, and he was on his way to claim it, or at least to look it in the eye. He turned the key and the engine coughed to life. Pulling out of the lot and into the steady stream of Denver traffic, he pointed the car south toward the distant, unseen mountains and the first real mystery of his life. The drive south from Durango was a descent into a world he didn't understand. Leaving Mr. Hoskins's small, quiet office, Marcus felt the weight of the old lawyer's warning settling in his gut. The man's words, "That place will break you," echoed with the grim authority of experience. For the first few miles, the road was a familiar strip of asphalt, a lifeline back to the concrete certainty of Denver. But ahead, the San Juan Mountains loomed, not as a picturesque postcard, but as a colossal, indifferent wall of rock and shadow. They were a barrier between the life he was leaving and the terrifying unknown he was driving toward. Every sign for Silverton was a marker pushing him further away from safety, each mile a quiet act of severing his last ties to the world he knew. The rental car, a fragile metal shell, seemed to shrink with every passing minute, a tiny vessel navigating the edge of an immense and unforgiving ocean of wilderness. The ascent began without ceremony. The road simply tilted upward, and the small engine of the sedan began to whine, a high, strained note that vibrated through the steering wheel and into Marcus's hands. The world outside the windows transformed, the dry plains giving way to dense forests of pine and aspen. The quality of the light changed, becoming sharper, clearer, as if the air itself was being stripped of its familiar haze. He felt a strange pressure building behind his eyes, a dull throb that was the first sign of the rising altitude. He was a city kid, born and raised at a mile high, but this was different. This was a climb into thin air, a physical journey into an environment his body was unprepared for. The car fought the incline, and Marcus felt a sympathetic strain in his own chest, as if he too were running out of oxygen. Then the pavement ended. It wasn't a gradual transition, but an abrupt, jarring halt. One moment he was on a smooth black surface, the next, the car lurched onto a dirt track, littered with loose gravel and deeply carved ruts. The sudden, violent shudder that ran through the vehicle felt like a point of no return. The sound changed from the hum of tires on asphalt to a constant percussive rattle of stones striking the car's undercarriage, each impact a small sharp report of damage being done. This was no longer a road. It was a suggestion of a path, a scar carved into the mountainside. He slowed the car to a crawl, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The civilization he had known was now officially behind him, accessible only by a path that seemed determined to shake his vehicle and his resolve to pieces. The sheer, profound isolation of his new reality began to press in on him. He hadn't seen another car for what felt like an hour. There were no houses, no fences, no power lines, no sign that humanity had ever staked a claim here, save for this brutal, winding track. The world was nothing but the narrow dirt path ahead, the dense, silent trees on either side, and the vast, empty sky above. The lawyer's weary, cynical voice echoed in his mind again, a voice of reason in a situation that felt increasingly insane. A wave of cold, paralyzing fear washed over him, so potent it made his foot ease off the accelerator. For a long, terrifying moment, he was frozen, a boy in a cheap rental car in the middle of a wilderness that could swallow him without a trace. The thought of turning back was a seductive, comforting whisper. He took a sharp, gasping breath, the thin air burning his lungs. No. He had come this far. He had spent half of his money. This was his decision, the first real one he had ever made, and he would see it through. He forced his foot back down on the gas pedal, the engine groaning in protest. He focused his entire being on the immediate, tangible task in front of him, keeping the wheels inside the deepest part of the ruts, navigating around the sharpest-looking rocks, anticipating the next jarring dip in the path. It was a simple, mechanical act, but it felt like a monumental gesture of courage. He was no longer just driving. He was fighting his way forward, battling the terrain, the car's limitations, and the crushing weight of his own fear. Each yard gained was a small, hard-won victory against the voice telling him to give up. The temperature gauge on the dashboard began its slow, ominous creep into the red. The constant low-gear struggle against the steep incline was overheating the engine. The whining sound intensified, becoming a desperate scream. He knew, with the borrowed knowledge of someone who had seen it in movies, that he had to stop or risk killing the car completely. He found a slightly wider spot in the track and pulled over, turning off the ignition. The sudden, absolute silence that descended was more jarring than the noise. The only sound was the frantic ticking of the cooling engine, a metallic heartbeat in the vast, still wilderness. He sat there, hands trembling slightly, surrounded by a quiet so deep it felt like a physical presence. The silence amplified his solitude, making him feel like the last person left on earth. He pushed the door open and stepped outside, his legs unsteady. The mountain air was a shock to his system, thin, cold, and sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth. He felt instantly lightheaded, a dizzying sensation that made him place a hand on the roof of the car to steady himself. He was high above the world now, a fact his body was keenly aware of. He looked back the way he came, but the track disappeared around a bend just a few dozen yards away. There was no sign of the road, no hint of the town he had left behind. There was only the forest, rising up on all sides, a silent, green ocean. The feeling of disorientation was complete. He was untethered, a small, fragile human being adrift in a place of immense, ancient power, and he had never felt more vulnerable in his life. After 10 minutes that felt like an hour, he got back in the car and started the engine. The temperature gauge had fallen back to the middle. He pressed on, the path growing even more treacherous. He consulted the crude map Mr. Hoskins had drawn for him on a piece of notepad paper, a few simple lines, and an X marking the ranch. It was barely a guide. Soon, he came upon a fork in the road, two equally unconvincing tracks splitting off into the trees. Neither was marked. The map showed only a single line. He was faced with a choice based on nothing but pure intuition. One path seemed slightly wider, the ruts a little deeper, suggesting more frequent use. It was a guess, a 50-50 shot in the middle of nowhere, and the wrong choice could mean losing precious time and fuel. He chose the wider path, praying it was the right one. His heart sank almost immediately. After a few hundred yards of careful navigation, the track ended abruptly, blocked by a massive, impassable rockslide. A tangle of fallen trees and enormous boulders lay across the path, a definitive dead end. A hot wave of frustration and near panic washed over him. He had wasted time, he had wasted gas, and now he had to perform the nerve-wracking task of reversing the car on a narrow shelf of a road with a steep drop-off on one side. He could hear the scrape of branches against the car's paint, a sound that made him cringe. His hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel as he slowly, painstakingly, backed the car down the track, his heart pounding with the fear of a single wrong move, sending the vehicle tumbling down the mountainside. Returning to the fork, he knew he had only one option left. He steered the car onto the other path, the one that had looked less promising. This track was immediately worse, narrower, and steeper than the first. Overgrown branches, thick as his arm, scraped and slapped against the windows, making it feel as if the forest itself were trying to reclaim the path and push him back. He could feel every rock, every root, every dip in the terrain through the thin seat and the vibrating steering column. The journey had become a grueling physical ordeal, a constant battle against a landscape that seemed actively hostile to his presence. He was no longer just driving to a destination. He was surviving a relentless assault, pushing a machine past its limits in a place where no help would come if it failed. He hit a particularly deep, water-filled pothole with a bone-jarring crash. The entire car slammed down on its suspension, and the steering wheel was nearly wrenched from his hands. For a sickening, heart-stopping moment, he was certain a tire had blown or an axle had snapped. The sound of the impact was final, brutal. He brought the car to a halt, the engine idling roughly, and sat in silence, waiting for the inevitable. He finally forced himself to get out and inspect the damage, his stomach churning with dread. He walked around the car, his eyes scanning the tires. They were muddy, but they were intact. He peered underneath, seeing no leaking fluids, no broken parts. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated luck, a small, undeserved miracle that felt like a sign. A wave of temporary relief washed over him, giving him just enough renewed determination to continue. The track began to level out, and the dense trees thinned, opening up to reveal the sky, and with it, the peaks. He saw them for the first time not as a distant barrier, but as his immediate surroundings. Jagged granite giants, their upper reaches dusted with snow, tore at a sky of the deepest, most impossible blue. The sheer scale of it was breathtaking and terrifying. He felt his own insignificance with a clarity that was almost spiritual. He was a tiny, fragile speck of life, crawling across the face of an immense, unfeeling God. All the problems of his life, the sterile offices, the temporary homes, the $270, seemed laughably small in the face of this majestic, silent power. His vulnerability was absolute, stripped bare by the raw, untamed beauty of the wilderness. Then, through a break in the last line of pine trees, he saw it, not as a clear image, but as a dark shape against a wide open valley, a structure, a roofline, the end of the path. He had been so focused on the struggle of the journey that the reality of the destination caught him completely off guard. A strange mix of emotions surged through him, a jolt of adrenaline, a profound sense of dread, and a fragile, terrifying flicker of anticipation. He had made it. Against all odds, against all reason, he had arrived at the place that belonged to the ghost of a man he'd never met. This broken piece of land was now his problem. He slowed the car to a crawl, navigating the last few hundred yards of the impassable track, the engine's strained whine the only sound in a world that had gone completely silent, holding its breath for what was to come. The rental car ticked as it cooled behind him, the small sound of final mechanical punctuation mark to a journey that had felt both impossibly long and terrifyingly fast. He was here. He had arrived. Standing at the edge of the overgrown track, Marcus Thorne looked out upon the land that was somehow his. The cabin was smaller than he had imagined, a dark, weathered structure of logs that seemed to be slowly sinking back into the earth from which it had come. Its roof sagged in the middle like a tired spine, and a barn nearby listed heavily to one side, a skeleton of a building surrendering to gravity and time. The fences were little more than broken teeth against the vast, wild landscape. It was a picture of decay, of profound and patient abandonment. And yet, as he stared at this broken piece of the world, a tremor started deep in his chest, a seismic event on the barren landscape of his soul. It grew into a wave, crashing through the emotional walls he had spent 16 years building, and he doubled over, racked by violent, gut-wrenching sobs that tore from him without permission, the raw sound swallowed by the immense silence of the mountains. After a long time, the storm inside him subsided, leaving him hollowed out and trembling in the thin, cold air. The tears had been a purge, a violent eviction of 16 years of unexpressed grief, fear, and a loneliness so deep he had never even dared to name it. He wiped his face with the sleeve of his worn jacket, the rough fabric scratching his cold skin. He could taste the salt of his own tears, a flavor as foreign as the pine-scented air he was breathing. A second vehicle, a sturdy pickup truck, rumbled to a stop behind his rental, and Mr. Hoskins got out, his face etched with a look that was not pity, but a kind of weary understanding. The old lawyer didn't say a word, just gave a slow nod toward the cabin, a silent gesture of permission. It was time. Marcus took a deep, shaky breath that felt like his first, and began the slow walk across the overgrown yard, his city sneakers sinking into the soft, untamed earth. The cabin's small porch groaned under his weight, the wood soft and spongy with age. He stood before the front door, a heavy thing made of thick, weathered planks. Its iron handle rusted a deep, angry orange. There was no lock, only a simple wooden latch. For a moment he hesitated, his hand hovering in the air. This felt like a trespass, like breaking into someone else's history. But it was his history too, wasn't it? A past he never knew he had. He finally gripped the cold iron, the texture rough and gritty against his palm, and pushed. The door swung inward with a low, mournful groan, the sound of a long-held silence being broken. The air that rushed out to meet him was a physical presence, a cold, still atmosphere, thick with the smell of dust, dry wood, and the faint, almost imperceptible scent of wood smoke, a ghost of a fire that had gone out decades ago. He stepped across the threshold, moving from the bright, sharp clarity of the mountain afternoon into a space of shadow and stillness. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust to the dim light filtering through a single grime-covered window. The inside of the cabin was a single large room, a time capsule sealed against the outside world. A stone fireplace stood cold and dark against one wall. Simple, hand-hewn furniture, a bed frame, a small table, 2 chairs, sat under a thick blanket of dust, their shapes softened by the grey shroud of time. Cobwebs, intricate and undisturbed, hung from the rafters like forgotten decorations. It was not a home. It was a monument to absence, a space defined entirely by the person who was no longer there. The silence within these walls was different from the silence of the mountains outside. It was heavier, weighted with the memory of a life lived in solitude. As his vision cleared, he saw it. The sight was so incongruous, so utterly out of place in the landscape of decay, that it seemed to be humming with its own energy. There, on the dusty surface of the small wooden table in the center of the room, sat a single object, a thick yellowed envelope. It was not covered in dust. It had not been forgotten. It had been placed there deliberately in the exact center of the table, a focal point in the room's emptiness. It was waiting. He took a hesitant step closer, his boots making soft, shuffling sounds on the dusty floorboards. He could see writing on the front, a name penned in a shaky but determined hand. It was not his full official name, the one that appeared on state documents. It was simply one word written with an unfamiliar intimacy: Marcus. His breath caught in his throat. The world seemed to shrink, the vast mountains and the dilapidated ranch disappearing until only he and this impossible object remained. He had expected to find a ruin, a problem, a debt. He had not expected to find a message. He had not expected to be addressed by a name that, until this moment, had felt like nothing more than a convenient label. Mr. Hoskins appeared in the open doorway behind him, his presence a quiet confirmation of what Marcus was seeing. The lawyer's voice was soft when he finally spoke. his words echoing the promise he had made to a dead man. He had told Marcus in his office that if he made the journey, if he came to see the place for himself, there would be a letter waiting for him, left by James. But hearing it and seeing it were two entirely different realities. He moved toward the table, as if in a trance, his legs feeling disconnected from his body. Every rational part of his mind, the part that had been trained for 16 years to expect nothing, was screaming that this was impossible. But the evidence was right there, a tangible piece of a past he couldn't comprehend. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers hovering just above the coarse paper of the envelope. This was not a legal document from a lawyer or a procedural form from a social worker. This was a direct communication from a ghost, a thread reaching across death and time to find him, specifically him, in this exact place. The sheer, deliberate intention of the act was a force more powerful than any he had ever encountered. It was in that precise moment, as his fingertips finally made contact with the dry, aged paper, that he understood the true source of the tears that had overwhelmed him just moments before. It hadn't just been the shock of the mountains or the weight of owning land. It was this. It was the sudden, crushing and beautiful realization that his existence had not been an accident ignored by the world. Someone had known his name. Someone had thought of him. Someone had spent their final days ensuring that he, a forgotten boy in a bureaucratic system, would be found. The sobs that had shaken him were not for a home he'd never had, but for the one that had been waiting for him all along, held in the heart of a man he'd never met. The letter was the key. It was the missing piece of his entire life, the foundation he never knew existed. The dilapidated cabin, the collapsing barn, the $6,000 debt, none of it mattered in the face of this single, profound truth. He was not an orphan of the system. He was the heir to a legacy, however broken it might be. The envelope in his hand was heavier than the sum of all his worldly possessions in his backpack. It contained more than just words. It contained a history, a connection, a reason. It was the crushing, beautiful, terrifying proof that he had not been forgotten. He had been waited for. And that knowledge, more than the land itself, was an inheritance so vast it would take him a lifetime to understand. His fingers, numb from the cold and the residual shock of his emotional breakdown, finally closed around the envelope. The paper was thick and dry, almost brittle, and felt warm against his skin, as if it held some latent heat from the person who had last touched it. He carried it with the reverence one might reserve for a sacred object, his steps slow and deliberate as he moved back out of the cabin and into the sharp, clarifying light of the mountain afternoon. Mr. Hoskins remained a respectful distance away, a silent witness to a moment that felt intensely private. Marcus sat on the edge of the groaning porch, the envelope resting on his knees, his own name written in that shaky script staring up at him. For a full minute, he did nothing but breathe, the thin air a constant reminder of how far he was from everything he had ever known. He was terrified of what was inside, terrified that it would be another cruel joke, another layer of complexity to a problem he couldn't solve, but he was more terrified of not knowing. With a final, steadying breath, he carefully broke the seal. The letter was a single page, folded twice. The paper was the same yellowed, brittle stock as the envelope, and it was covered in a dense, slightly slanted script. The ink faded from black to a soft gray. He began to read, the words of a dead man reaching out to him from across a silent void. The letter started without preamble, as if continuing a conversation that had been waiting 16 years to happen. The first sentence explained everything and changed everything. James Redhawk was not some distant, unknown relative. He was his grandmother's brother, his mother's uncle. He wrote of Marcus's mother, a girl he remembered as wild and lost, who had run away to the city and had a child she couldn't care for. The words were simple, factual, and held no judgment, only a deep and abiding sorrow. In an instant, the sterile, bureaucratic fact of his abandonment was transformed into a human story, a tragedy with names and relationships, and he, Marcus, was at the center of it. James explained that when he learned Marcus had been left at the hospital, he had tried to intervene. He was the only family left, but the state had looked at his life, an old man living alone, off-grid in a dilapidated cabin, with no steady income and his own failing health, and had deemed him unfit. He was too poor, too isolated, too old to be considered a viable guardian. The system, in its cold and impartial logic, had rejected him. The guilt from that failure, he wrote, had been the heaviest burden of his life. He described years of trying to track Marcus through the foster care system, a bureaucratic maze that was designed to protect privacy, but which effectively erased a child's past. For 16 years, while Marcus was being moved from house to house, learning to be invisible, this old man in the mountains had been searching for him, a ghost trying to connect with a ghost. The words blurred as a new wave of emotion, entirely different from the first, rose in Marcus's throat. This wasn't the grief of abandonment. It was the overwhelming shock of being wanted. He had spent his entire life believing he was a piece of debris, something discarded and forgotten. But he hadn't been forgotten. He had been missed, he had been searched for. The narrative of his life, a story he had built on the foundational belief of his own unworthiness, crumbled in a matter of seconds. The walls he had built to protect himself from the pain of being unwanted were suddenly pointless. A fortress built to defend against an attack that had never actually come. The enemy wasn't a world that didn't want him. It was a system that had prevented the one person who did from reaching him. He had to stop reading, his chest aching with a pressure that was both painful and liberating. He forced his eyes back to the page, his hand shaking so much the paper trembled. James's tone shifted from one of regret to one of purpose. "I can't give you back the years the world stole from us," the shaky script read. "I can't give you a childhood. I can only give you what I have left. I can give you land. This land belonged to our people long before any lines were drawn on a map. It is a place to start over, a foundation, or it is a thing to sell to get a better start somewhere else. The choice is yours, son, and whatever you choose is the right choice. You don't owe me anything." The word son struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was a word of affection and belonging he had never had directed at him. It was an anointing, a claim, a thread of connection woven directly into the fabric of his being. The letter wasn't just emotion. It was a practical guide, a final act of care from a man who knew he was leaving Marcus with a monumental challenge. At the bottom of the page, James had drawn a crude but clear map. It showed the location of the cabin and about 500 meters to the east, an X marking a natural spring. "The water is clean and it never runs dry," he had written beside it. It's a start. And then came the final, most unbelievable revelation. "The taxes are a burden, I know. I saved what I could. Look under the third floorboard from the west wall of the barn, near the old forge. It's not enough to fix everything, but it might be enough to hold on if that's what you choose to do." It was a treasure map, a final desperate provision from a man who had nothing, but who had given everything he could. He read the letter a second time and then a third, the words sinking deeper into his soul with each pass. This piece of paper was the single most important object he had ever held. It was a Rosetta Stone for his own life, translating the meaningless symbols of his past into a language of love, regret, and profound, stubborn hope. It was proof that he was not the product of indifference, but the recipient of a hidden, silent, and unwavering devotion. He carefully folded the letter and placed it inside his jacket, the paper resting against his chest like a shield. He felt Mr. Hoskins's eyes on him, but he didn't look up. He had one more thing to do. He had to see if the final part of this impossible story was true. He stood up on unsteady legs and began to walk toward the collapsing skeleton of the barn. The barn doors had long since rotted off their hinges, leaving a dark, gaping maw that smelled of hay, rust, and damp earth. Sunlight streamed through the holes in the roof, illuminating swirling dust motes in the silent air. In the corner, just as James had described, was the ruin of an old forge, a heavy anvil still sitting on a stump beside it. Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, hopeful rhythm in the profound quiet. He knelt on the dirt floor, his eyes scanning the weathered floorboards. They were wide, thick planks of wood, warped and grey with age. He counted them from the west wall. 1, 2, 3. The third board looked no different from the others, settled firmly in the dirt. His hope faltered. It was too much to believe. It was a fantasy, the last wishful thinking of a dying man. He searched the edges of the board with his fingers, feeling for a loose nail, a gap, anything that would allow him to get a grip. His fingers were raw, scraped by the rough, splintered wood. For several minutes he found nothing. The board was solid, immovable. A familiar despair, cold and sharp, began to creep back in. Of course it wasn't real, it was a story, but he refused to give up. He remembered the old anvil. Using all his strength, he managed to slide a heavy, rusted pair of blacksmith's tongs from the forge. He wedged the tip into a tiny crack between the third and fourth boards and leaned back, putting his entire weight into it. The old wood groaned in protest, a sound of deep reluctance. Then, with a sharp crack, a nail gave way. He worked the tongs back and forth, the gap widening with each movement. Finally, he was able to get his fingers underneath the edge of the plank. He pulled. The board lifted, releasing the scent of rich, dark earth that had been trapped beneath it for decades. And there, nestled in a small, hollowed-out space in the dirt, was a metal box, rusted but intact. It was an old ammunition can, heavy and solid, his breath hitched in his throat. It was real. Everything was real. With trembling hands, he lifted the box from its hiding place and unlatched the lid. The hinges shrieked in protest. He lifted the lid, and his breath left him in a single, silent rush. The box was filled with cash. Not a few bills, but thick, tightly bound stacks of 20s and 50s, held together with faded rubber bands. He didn't count it. He didn't need to. He just stared, his mind unable to process the reality of what he was seeing. This was more than money. This was time. This was sacrifice. This was years of a lonely old man's life, every spare dollar he had, saved and hidden away in the dirt, for a boy he had never met. It was the physical manifestation of his love and his guilt. Each bill was a prayer, a hope that Marcus would one day find his way here. This was the proof. This was the final, irrefutable evidence that he had been loved. He gently closed the lid of the box, his movements slow and reverent. He didn't stand up. He simply knelt there on the dirt floor of the collapsing barn, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, and for the third time that day he began to cry. But these were not the tears of grief or shock. They were the quiet, cleansing tears of a boy who had just been found. He looked at the money, a tangible tool for a future he hadn't dared to imagine an hour ago. It was $3,000, a small fortune to him, but more importantly, it was a lifeline. It was enough to start a payment plan for the taxes. It was enough to buy food and supplies. It was a buffer against the immediate, crushing threat of failure. This wasn't just a gift of land. It was the gift of a chance. James Redhawk hadn't just left him a problem. He had left him a solution, a path forward, however difficult it might be. The weight of the responsibility was immense, but for the first time it felt manageable. The inheritance was no longer a trap. It was a challenge, and it was one he now felt equipped to face, armed with a history he never knew he had, and the final desperate savings of a man who believed in him. He thought of the system that had defined his existence, the beige offices and the sterile paperwork. It had seen him as a case file, a number, a liability to be managed until he could be legally discharged. It had never known, and would never care, that 100 miles away in the mountains, an old man was fighting his own quiet, desperate battle to reclaim him. The system had provided shelter, but James had provided a home. The system had given him a transition stipend of $270, but James had given him a foundation, a history, and the means to begin again. The contrast was so stark, so profound, it redrew the entire map of his life. He was not a product of the state. He was the last of the Redhawks. The silence of the barn was no longer empty. It was filled with a sense of presence, a feeling of being watched over. He could almost feel the ghost of James beside him, a quiet, reassuring presence in the dusty, sunlit air. He finally understood that the journey he had taken, the reckless decision to spend half his money to come here, was the most important act of his life. It was a pilgrimage he didn't even know he was making. He had come seeking an answer to a legal problem, a question of property and debt. Instead, he had found the answer to the fundamental question of his own existence. He belonged to someone. He belonged to this land. He belonged to a story that was much older and stronger than his own 16 years of solitude. He carried the metal box back to the cabin, its weight a comforting, solid presence in his hands. He set it on the dusty table, right next to where the letter had been. The two objects sat side by side, the story and the means, the love and the legacy. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones what he was going to do. He would not sell. He would not run. He would stay. He would honor the sacrifice that had been made for him. He would take this broken, beautiful, impossible gift, and he would make it a home. It would be the hardest thing he had ever done, a battle against time, poverty, and the wilderness itself. But he would not be doing it alone. He would be doing it for the both of them. The drive back to Durango felt entirely different. He sat in Mr. Hoskins's quiet office, the same space where just a day before he had been warned away from this very decision. He placed the signed papers on the lawyer's desk, his hand steady. He used the cash from the metal box to establish a payment plan for the back taxes, the act feeling less like a financial transaction and more like a sacred vow. Mr. Hoskins watched him with a look of weary resignation that slowly transformed into something resembling respect. He had seen the kid who would be broken by this place. He was now looking at a young man who had been remade by it. The legalities were a formality. The real inheritance had already been claimed, not with a signature, but with the tears of a boy who had finally found his way home. The next 2 years were a brutal, unglamorous education in survival and resilience. He didn't move into the cabin right away. It was too far gone. Instead, he made his home in a small, functional trailer James had kept hidden behind the barn, a relic from some long-forgotten project. This tiny metal box became his entire world. He learned that the mountain cold was a living thing, a predator that could seep through any crack and steal the warmth from your bones. He learned the profound solitude of a winter night when the snow falls so heavily it swallows all sound. He taught himself basic construction and repair skills, not from a mentor, but from watching grainy videos on his phone, huddled by the trailer's small window, to catch the weak, intermittent cell signal that was his only link to the outside world. He took a part-time job at a hardware store in Silverton, a 45-minute drive down the treacherous mountain track. The job provided a meager but essential income for tools, building supplies, and gas. More importantly, it provided human contact. It was there he learned the quiet language of the mountains, the shorthand of people who lived with the land, not just on it. And it was through that job that he met the Millers, a ranching family whose property was 20 miles deeper into the valley. They were a quiet, sturdy people who saw in Marcus not a troubled kid from the city, but a neighbor. They offered him practical help, a used generator, advice on how to fix a leaking roof, a hot meal on a cold night, without ever asking for anything in return. They became the first community, the first semblance of a family he had ever known. Slowly, painfully, piece by piece, he brought the ranch back to life. He started with the cabin, replacing the rotted logs, rebuilding the sagging roof, and reglazing the old windows. Every swing of the hammer, every board he cut felt like an act of devotion, a conversation with the ghost of James Redhawk. He discovered a patience and a skill within himself he never knew he possessed, a talent for seeing the potential in broken things and making them whole again. He began building rustic furniture from the fallen aspen trees on the property, his hands finding a new purpose in shaping the raw wood into something beautiful and useful. The work was hard, the progress was slow, and there were countless moments of failure and despair. But he never once thought of quitting. He was not just building a house, he was building a life. Today, Marcus Thorne is 20 years old. He lives in the restored cabin where a fire now burns brightly in the stone hearth. He has a small, thriving organic garden that provides most of his food, and he sells the furniture he builds at a local market in Durango. He is not wealthy or famous. His life is quiet, defined by the rhythm of the seasons and the demands of the land. The mountains that once seemed so intimidating are now his sanctuary, their silent majesty a source of peace, not fear. The profound loneliness of his past has been replaced by a deep and satisfying solitude. He has friends in the Millers, a purpose in his work, and a foundation beneath his feet that is as solid as the granite peaks that surround him. He still has the letter. He keeps it in a small wooden box he made himself, and sometimes on quiet nights he takes it out and reads it again. The words are no longer a shocking revelation, but a comforting reminder, the founding document of his new life. He understands now that the tears he shed on that first day, the violent, gut-wrenching sobs of a boy who felt utterly alone, were not tears of sorrow. They were the tears of recognition, the revolutionary, life-altering shock of finally having a place to plant his roots. And now when a stranger asks him where he's from, a question that used to fill him with a hollow ache, he can simply look toward the snow-capped peaks, smile and say with a quiet, unshakable certainty, "I'm from here."